These are the Beam Chronicles, with your host, MJ Dooney. Book 2, Compromise. Chapter 2, Jaxon Teaque.
Press conferences sucked. Charlie, Sydney, and I would sit at a long table with the Beam logo hanging behind our heads, typically right after we finished a bus, so occasionally right after we'd equalize someone. Hardly the time anyone would want to answer questions about the job they hated, and yet that's exactly what we did. A room full of hand-selected lapdogs would be in their pre-assigned seats asking us fluffy, happy questions about how cool it was to be part of the team and how good it felt to keep people safe. They'd laugh at all the jokes. They'd never challenge any part of the blatantly corrupt system we were forced to support. Never even had any idea of the coercion, the lies, and the cover-ups. Didn't dare question it, or else they'd get tossed. See, as far as Beam was concerned, real journalism was a threat. Any attempt to ask a legitimate question to hold Beam accountable or shine light on the shadows would result in an article that no citizen in the country would concern themselves with reading, specifically if it vilified Ava directly, plus a general blacklisting from any future press conferences that we hosted, and occasionally violent retribution. First Amendment? What First Amendment? Peter Cranston was a scumbag, but he had a certain masterful artistry about the way he orchestrated public opinion that I had to respect. By far his most controversial call wound up being the most impressive. A casual approach to social media with an intense focus on traditional. This in the year of our Lord 2014 was a decision, one that the clearly more plugged in and youthful crew of me and my friends assumed would be his downfall, but it turned out 2 years later he kind of hit the nail on the head. It turned out nobody could really compete with the YouTube videos and Instagram posts that Peter created of us, considering having our abilities was technically illegal, and Beam was the only entity with the access to produce this content. It turned out everything with us in it went viral in seconds, no effort required. And it turned out that no matter how much stuff he put out there was an insatiable vacuum for the clamoring masses to get their fix of the world's biggest celebrities. Filling that vacuum with good old-fashioned newspapers and magazines was a masterful way of controlling the entire narrative without appearing to be controlling it. Random assholes on Twitter were chaotic, unpredictable, but they had nothing to post of merit because they didn't have the access. What remained was the press, and Peter manipulated the press beautifully. Made sure the crowd at these events suited his specific requirements for an honorable, calculated representation of our bureau, exactly the way he wanted it to be drawn up. It only took 3, maybe 4 press conferences for everyone to grasp how things would operate. They were to report on our heroics, pump up our celebrity, reflect on our colorful and winning personalities, and make the public fall in love with their beloved champions time and time again. If they didn't, if they wrote about anything else, they would lose access to the world's favorite story. And if they still wrote about us without attending pressers, Peter would bury them in libel scandals, discredit them as a source, erase them. And between his vast array of connections, the callous depths of his selfish soul, and the Beam resources at its disposal, he was willing and able to erase anyone. Whatever it took, Peter had it in him, all to simply keep people distracted from the horror of what we were actually doing. He didn't just do the job well, I think he got off on it. Considering this, no surprise, he was always there. Through every presser, Cranston would be standing at the back exit, folding his arms and beaming proudly at his erected facade, nodding at the good questions, taking notes on the bad responses, jotting down coaching tips for me to make me more interesting or sympathetic or mysterious. It was an act, a game, just like all of Beam, sure, but then worse. All I did when we were in that room was lie, and Cranston was my deceit coach, coordinating the specifics and molding it to perfection, the artisan sculptor of the perfect lies. It was enough to make me sick to my stomach if I really gave it any serious consideration, so usually I just shut it out and plunged ahead. It's funny, I used to really struggle with doing that. By the time we busted Fischer, I was probably better than Charlie. bar none, the best of the three of us at this celebrity thing was me. And while it left a bilious taste in my mouth to be so fake and pander to the crowd, disguising our prison as some sort of interesting game that anyone would be so lucky to play, I was happy to take this particular bullet for Sydney and Charlie. They had done so much for me. In my 3 years now at Beam, thanks entirely to them, I had killed exactly 0 people, yet after all their best efforts to rescue me from the guilt, I felt guilty about not having anything to offer them in return. Guilt was sort of my modus operandi, my inevitable response, a trait I personally attribute to a Catholic upbringing, but if Charlie and Sydney were going to murder for me, the least I could do was lie for them. I faked my way through all of the pressers with their friendly smile, a down-to-earth charm, a cheery willingness, compensating for my family and keeping Peter Cranston and transitively Howard Prophet happy with the show. You wouldn't think it was a fair exchange, murder for friendly small talk, but then you'd have to realize just how terrible Charlie and Sydney were at being famous. I think either of them would gladly have accepted the terms of our unspoken agreement if I presented it to them directly. At least Sydney tried. And yeah, the first impressions he left on both media and the so-called fans alike were typically awkward or off-putting. But as time went by, he persisted with his efforts to keep Prophet pleased with his performances. The world warmed up to Big Purple. They began to see him for the bizarre yet lovable teddy bear that he was, and things he used to do or say that would leave people in a puzzled silence now generated an excited laughter. Sydney being Sydney, they adored him in time. They never truly understand him, the way Charlie and I did, though. And he was still prone to some strange random outbursts, stories about his lobster or something, that occasionally set people back into their old uncomfortable reactions. This wild card nature made it tough for even a genius like Peter to stage him correctly. Furthermore, asking Sydney to play any sort of role, let's just say he doesn't have the acting chops to convincingly pull it off. So once people got to love him, Sydney was just what he was. There was no strings for Cranston to pull to get the reactions he was gunning for, which left him as empty dead weight as far as our publicist was concerned. No hindrance to his methods, but no asset either. Charlie, on the other hand, was a hindrance. Like lead brick shackled to Cranston's ankle in the middle of the ocean. Unlike Sydney, she did not try at all. In the sense that when press conferences rolled around, the only reason she would begrudgingly even bother to show up was to support me and Sydney. And maybe also she was afraid that if she didn't, Prophet would shut her off. An experience she'd only described to me once in 3 years, and I dare not request more details than what she'd offered up. But physically being at the events was literally the extent of her willingness to cooperate with Peter's games. She would sit at her seat on the far left, tip her chair back as far as it would go without toppling over, prop her boots up onto the table, crossed at the ankle, and focus on chewing her nails, regardless of what else happened. She'd make this little clicking noise between the fingernails of her ring finger and thumb, but beyond that, utter silence. Questions directed at Charlie were occasionally picked up by me or Sid, but for the most part, it had been well established talking to her was a waste of time. She didn't speak, period. The veterans of the group knew to just let her sit there quietly. And, like I mentioned, they were predominantly veterans now anyway, to prevent any hotshot young reporters from popping up with any ideas about asking the wrong kinds of questions. Or, I guess maybe the right kind. It all depended on perspective. The Fischer conference drew a respectable crowd, but nothing overwhelming. It paled in comparison to the hordes of screaming nerds at the conventions, angrily assaulting me with inconsistencies in my fighting techniques and more practical applications of my abilities. Those were by far the most terrifying appearances. This was nothing. Yeah, there were a lot of them, but reporters played by Cranston's rules, stayed in line, kept it flippant and unfocused. Hell, I was barely doing any talking. Sydney had taken it on himself to handle most of the questions for this particular case, given his attachment to Hodge, and I wouldn't deprive him of the opportunity to do right by his hero. I admired his enthusiasm, even if I couldn't match it, given the tragic certainty of Hodge's eventual downfall. So while Kavorsky filled the air with an outline of the strategies and tactics of our recently completed battle, I scanned the room for familiar faces, or interesting new ones. I instantly locked onto Murphy, yawning in the back next to Cranston. Clearly, it had been requested of him that he attend for appearances only. what with the case being so politically crucial. But Murphy had as much interest in public relations as Charlie did, and I had to stifle a few snickers as I watched him shuffling his mustache, checking his watch, then his email, then his watch again, as if any time had passed. I caught his attention briefly, and we exchanged a smile and a nod. Peter frowned beside Murphy and elbowed him in the ribs to keep him from distracting me. Murph just rolled his eyes, kept on fidgeting. I hadn't seen Howie in weeks, but he always was too busy to show up to any of our pressers anyway. I could usually count on him to seat a burly liaison in a dark suit with dark sunglasses somewhere in the masses, just to ensure things ran like he wanted. Sometimes he'd even send me messages through this surrogate if I was saying things he particularly wished I wouldn't say, or in a way he didn't want me to say them. I quickly scanned the room for the typically conspicuous man and finally found him, a bulky and stoic bald guy seated front row center. It was strange for Howie's man to be so close to the action. I found myself wondering if perhaps Howie had a prophetic vision for today's events, a so-called forecast, and he wanted to keep his eyes up front just to make sure things played out right. I also lost in contemplation. The standing reporter had to repeat my name 3 times before I blinked back into reality.
Jaxon.
Sorry, Hugh. I shook my head, smiling a plastered smile. Long day. Did Sydney mention how many bullets I caught?
We asked, but he didn't get a good count.
Hugh Conrad of the Capital Times. I was well versed in the big players' names and employers at Peter's request. Yeah, me neither, come to think of it. Like I said, long day. The room laughed falsely. Repeat the question for me, Mr. Conrad.
Sydney was just explaining to us how much he respected Clifton Hodge as an individual and how deeply his assassination impacted him. I was looking for a comment from you about Hodge. How did you feel when you heard he was killed?
Right. Terrible day, for sure, and my thoughts go out to his family, first and foremost. I know he had a kid, a daughter. My dad died when I was pretty young, so I get how tough that is. I was admittedly playing to their sentimental sympathies a little bit, but unlike most, this answer wasn't entirely inauthentic. As for Clifton Hodge himself, I have nothing but the highest esteem. He was a great man who wasn't afraid to speak up for what he believed in. The world could use more of those.
Seriously?
It came from the back of the room. A quiet, almost offhanded objection to my statement on Hodge. It sounded young, so I glanced over the rows in the back for somebody who might match it. That endeavor wasn't hard. Only one kid looked like he wanted to swallow his own tongue to keep it from betraying him again. That you, man? I asked with a friendly smile.
Sorry, I didn't mean to... I wasn't trying to be disruptive.
Not at all. I assured him as kindly as I could. What's your name?
Body. Patrick Body.
Patrick.
Sydney excitedly exclaimed.
I have a lobster who shares that name.
The room full of reporters chuckled warmly at his unusual non sequitur, but I focused on the human, Patrick. Haven't seen you at one of these things before, Mr. Body, you knew?
No. Well, I mean, this is my first one.
Which, if I'm not mistaken, would make you new. More chuckles accompanying my broad grin to indicate to Patrick it was all in good fun. I'd zeroed in on the kid intentionally. He had the potential to fulfill a very specific purpose for me, scratch a personal itch. Sometimes when you're stranded on a deserted island, you just have to put a message into a bottle and chuck it out to sea, even if you know damn well nobody would ever see it. Patrick could provide me with a bottle. I just had to make sure he was the right fit before I pressed him for it. Who are you here with, buddy?
Capital U Daily, the college paper.
Capital U, good school.
Yeah, you're an alumnus, right?
Honorary alumnus. Technically, I didn't even finish my first semester. I got drafted to a higher cause too quickly. In fact, if you're a senior, you're probably older than me.
I am a senior, and older than you, I guess.
What's your major?
Mechanical engineering. I do the paper just for extracurricular. I need to get into grad school, you know?
Good. No quest for higher achievement in journalism. Didn't have a name to sully. Beam could blacklist away after I attained my moral victory.
Sorry, I'm completely wasting time here. It was nice meeting you. You can get back to people, you know, doing their jobs.
No, it's fine. I like encouraging young writers. Besides, I have a special place in my heart for what would have been my alma mater, you know? He sheepishly nodded. How about... I suggested more to Peter than to Patrick. I give you 5 minutes, open questioning. Whatever you want, no holds barred, nothing off limits. Get you a nice juicy story. It'll look super impressive on the grad apps. Then I'll stay an extra 5 to get the big dogs their punches.
I as well.
Sydney chimed in, somewhat aware of my intentions. I glanced over to Charlie, who rolled her eyes and shrugged wordlessly, pantomimed a little jerking off gesture. This equated to enthusiasm for her, I could tell.
That sounds cool to me, Jaxon.
All of this pending publicist approval, of course, your show, Peter. I nodded to Cranston. It was a tactic, get the whole room turning around to look at him. That way, if he rejected my offer to body, he'd have to crush the kid's spirit in front of the whole room. Peter was a man all about appearances, didn't have the balls to look bad when I put him on the spot. He instead just nodded politely and gestured Body the floor.
Oh, by all means, my man, ask away.
And as Body leafed through his notebook to his prepared questions that he never thought he'd get to ask, I did a quick check with Howie's liaison in the front row. Statuesque, immobile. I'd have to keep a careful eye to make sure that stayed the same, depending on what Body dug up, especially since I was planning on helping him dig.
Okay. I have a history of your responses to negative statements made about Beam.
Sure, let's hear it.
Preacher Gino called Beam a repugnant example of the devil's influence on Earth. When asked to comment, you said, he's raising some important points that should be talked about more than they are. Plus, I think I've met the devil, and I agree his influence on Earth could afford to be lessened.
The crowd laughed, even Prophet's crony a little bit, but Peter pulled a handkerchief out of his breast pocket and wiped the sweat off his brow, already disturbed by the direction of this little endeavor. Body kept going.
When Eric Brady apologized for his comments implicating Beam's actions and social injustice, you were quoted as saying the apology was unnecessary. Now Clifton Hodge is murdered and you go beyond expressing remorse for his death to say the world could use more people like him.
Yes, it could. Is there a question in this?
You insist on speaking so kindly about people who blatantly hate you. Is it an act or are you that impossibly understanding?
Good. He wasn't perfect, far from objective, but the closest thing to actual journalism I'd seen in a while. I had to be careful not to lead him off a cliff, but at least it was the right brand of question. Well, neither of those, but I also don't think Hodge hated me.
Well, I have a quote from him 3 weeks ago.
God, not this quote again. Patrick shuffled through his notes until he arrived on the appropriate page, cleared his throat, and read aloud the words I knew so well I could recite them in a coma.
On the topic of the equalizers who refer to themselves as Ava, I consider them to be either mankind in history's most depraved, reprehensible hypocrites, or its most disgusting display of coerced semi-cannibalism utilized as entertainment.
Misquoted. Every single time they dropped the second half. Hodge went on in that statement to say, I know of no person as dubious and nefarious as these 3 children are depicted to our society, and I hesitate to assume anyone is capable of such low moral fiber, which leads me to believe that their popularity is nothing more than the misguided celebration of their imprisonment and bondage. And to them I offer my sincerest pity. It was the most poignant and direct expression of understanding of our precise situation that anyone had ever pieced together, at least in public, and Peter Cranston mangled it, misrepresented it, and denied it to us by truncating it to make it seem the opposite. It was used to show the world that Clifton Hodge hated us, their darlings. He was telling them not to be too judgmental of us for our part, and it was rebranded as Hodge Hates Ava. Making it all the worse, we were instructed not to insist on the quote in its entirety, but to be frank, the only people who'd heard the whole thing had been bribed or threatened into keeping it a secret anyway. What's your point, Buddy? I asked with another friendly smile.
Yeah, sounds like he hated you, is all.
Does it? Because to me it sounds like he might have hated me, but he didn't know me well enough to decide. It had grown to be my classic rebuttal to the Hodge quote. It got a few amused snorts from the reporters who hadn't heard it. Patrick himself scoffed, puzzled how to proceed with the quest I'd sent him on if I was gonna box him out like this. But I was only directing him. Asking me my real opinions on Hodge was a dead end anyway. If I tried to give him a cleaner picture, Howie would burn me for it. Him too. I kept nodding to Patrick, instilling him with the confidence to investigate some other avenue of a story so completely porous with holes it was sieve-like. Another vein, another alley, another angle. It wasn't like there were only a few of them.
Rick Fischer applied to join Ava, correct?
Beautiful. Yeah, that's pretty common actually. We get hundreds of apps per month from anomalies who think they got what it takes to join our ranks.
Do they? Has anyone who mailed in an application ever even been considered?
We treat each application the same way we would an AAC, admission of anomalistic capacity. The room eagerly jotted it down, and Peter shot me a smarmy grin, making the OK sign with his fingers as Charlie suppressed her laughter. This was literally the first time anyone had ever used the phrase AAC, but Peter and the press didn't know that. Besides, people did admit they were anomalies all the time, we just didn't have a fancy acronym for it. But the press loved getting in on our jargon and nomenclature. It made them feel like they were part of the process hip, on the ground floor. Making one up was like pretending to throw a ball for them to fetch. It kept them entertained and occupied while Patrick and I discussed important things. AAC bypassed scouting and jumped straight to evaluations, only without the anonymous observation. Instead, it's voluntary interviews and demonstrations and stuff. From there, they're processed the same way any case would be, typically with certain additional leniency and punishment if it comes to that, which it usually does.
You didn't answer the question, though. Has anyone ever been considered?
No. Well, I guess Sydney technically was in AAC. False laughter from an insincere horde, but it was a good start. Established Prophet had access to Fischer, that Fischer was desperate to please him, that there was some specific task how he needed handled, namely Clifton Hodge. A sufficient nibble around the edges without outright involving Prophet. You could argue it was discreet enough to be nothing at all, but that was the only sort of thing Prophet would let by. Body kept going.
How far along in the process did Fischer get?
Let's see. I should know this. I just read it this morning. Cue the laugh track. Fully evaluated. Deemed unfit for Ava on grounds of insufficient power. Set to be defanged by confiscation of technology. Handed over to proper authorities. In this case, local police.
Why wasn't he? Before he got to Hodge, I mean.
He had a long line in front of him. We process equalizations by a specific priority. Most dangerous first, and after that, it's just a queue. Fischer wasn't that threatening. We had bigger fish.
Until he killed Hodge.
I smirked. He, made himself a more significant target when he started executing public figures. Yeah, in hindsight, we should have acted sooner, but he was a PR 0.7 with no apparent violent tendencies, so he got backburnered. It's just protocol. It would have been riskier to handle Fischer up front and let other more dangerous anomalies linger.
Sorry, PR 0.7.
The crowd groaned at his neophyte knowledge of our hip slang, but it was a concept I was quick enough at explaining to keep their interest. Potency rating, how powerful he is. Charlie's a 10, so Fischer was 7% of Charlie. Essentially no threat. You could have taken it with a pointy enough stick.
Yeah, but today when you guys fought him, he seemed pretty threatening.
Well, yeah, because he smacked. Again, the room jotted down my acronym, although this time it was genuine. I explained further. Secondary manifestation of anomalistic capacity, SMAC, smack. Sometimes when the time gap between evaluation and equalization is long enough, the anom picks up some PR points by natural growth and surprises the equalizers. Tyler Foon, for example, smacked between our fights. When Charlie and I first fought him, we could beat him up a bit, even at full blue. The second time, he was completely impervious. That's a smack. Usually a good, significant smack takes a while. Foon was several months locked up before he busted out. This story was all tactics and distraction, keeping Howie and Peter and the moronic suck-up reporters satisfied. People loved Tales of Ava before they knew about it. People loved when I talk about our nemesis, Tyler Foon. This story had it all. It would sell papers, compensate for the boring, dirty truth, the juicy story I was helping an engineering student discover for his college newsletter.
You sure evaluations didn't just miss something?
Yeah, I bet he had the 2-story murder bot under a big old tarp in the garage and told me it was just an art sculpture. Cheap, phony laughter, more tactics. Honestly, Patrick, evaluations makes a living out of finding things people don't want found. You couldn't hide your embarrassing middle school yearbook photo from Beam, much less Fischer's toy from today. Plus, remember that he volunteered for the eval. He was showing off the entire time. Why leave something that big off your resume? No, this wasn't a botched job. Evals is too good for that. Fischer smacked.
What was his PR rating post-smack?
I sighed, exasperatedly prepping to wade through some red tape. I'm obligated to inform you that any potency rating I assign to an anomaly, while accurate, is completely unofficial. I'm experienced enough with the system to do so, but not qualified. If you cite my rating in your story without including this statement, Beam will sue you for libelous misrepresentation. Good? He smirked. He wasn't an idiot and seemed to have realized by now that he and I were two sides of the same coin, that I was holding his hand and leading him through a minefield that I'd memorized a long time ago. Patrick Body got the picture, even if everyone else in the room was blind. He was a high 5006 with the new machinery. Any one of us could have easily taken him on solo, but that PR would have been even higher if he had any clue what the hell he was doing.
You're saying he seemed inexperienced at driving it?
I'm saying he broke his hexapedal mech hymen today. This was blatantly his first time. I caught a glimpse of Peter's disappointed frown in my peripherals. I wasn't supposed to talk about things like lost virginity when I talked to the press, not Boy Scout Jaxon. Nobody else seemed to mind the slight bit of crudity, though, and it made Charlie Nose laugh, which was worth whatever Peter would say about it later.
You mentioned Foon smacked over the course of several months in prison. How long between Fischer's initial evaluation and today's bust?
A week, maybe. And look, if he were naturally powered, I wouldn't think much about that timeline. Charlie and Sydney day-to-day are more powerful. I have bruises from skirmishes to prove it. Rhythmic, predictable laughter. Razzle-dazzle him, keep him on line while I light up my signal flare. Anyway, there's not like a set schedule for it or anything, but usually it's a bit more gradual, especially when it's technological.
So 4 or 5 points in 1 week.
That's fishy. Also, consider the gap in ability between making boots that shake the ground and making a 25-foot death robot. That's pretty sizable. You could probably attest to that, mechanical engineering and all.
So just to summarize, you're saying he shouldn't have been able to make it, and even if he had, not in a time frame. Add on to that the fact he didn't know how to drive it. Do you think somebody gave him the upgrade? Do you think somebody else smacked Rick Fischer?
Bingo. I'm not eligible to make that speculation yet, but we aren't going to rule out the idea that Fischer was just the bullet in Hodge's assassination and continue looking for the gun. Or possibly even the shooter. However many levels it goes, they'll get theirs. Done. It was all the more I could press the issue. In the right light, which was the light everyone would set it in, I was just demonstrating the tenacity and thoroughness of Beam's investigation process and showcasing my lack of animosity toward Hodge. Simultaneously, it was a tricky way for me to stick it to Prophet privately, letting him know he wasn't half as sneaky as he thought. It was enough to quell my inner turmoil temporarily. Message in a bottle sent out. Any bolder of an assertion would be seen as one step too far, and I could tell by the menacing way Prophet's surrogate was glaring at me, scratching his neck. Time to stop poking the bear. Anyway, that's 5. That should get you a nice little piece. Good luck with school. I was resigned to spend the rest of the conference smiling, faking it, playing my part and letting Sid do most of the talking. But Body missed my intention. He wouldn't shake off.
Jaxon, who could possibly benefit from Rick Fischer getting more powerful between his assassination of Hodge and now? Why make him stronger, but not strong enough to stop you guys? What did it accomplish for whoever it was that might have beefed him up?
Well, that was easy. Firstly, it made for a better show, drummed up more buzz than if we just knocked on his door and arrested him. Secondly, Fischer was in Beam custody following the buzz due to his smack. He was too legit, too strong to hand over to the police now. Who would benefit from keeping him from telling the police what happened? Moreover, who would benefit in him telling Beam what happened instead of the police? Obviously, Prophet. More obviously, I couldn't say any of that, but I also couldn't hang Patrick Body out to dry so suddenly. He thrust us both onto a narrow ledge here. It would take a cautious sequence of non-committal word choices to get us back to base camp, but I'd gotten good at saying a lot of words that meant nothing. I don't know, Patrick. It's one of those questions we'll be investigating in the follow-up. Maybe some punk just wanted to demonstrate his toys, make us aware of how quickly he could turn a 0.7 into a 6. Staged all publicly so we knew not to mess around. Whoever it was, he's clearly no slouch. We'll have to take extra precautions not to bull rush into anything.
But then why not just fight you himself? If he could drive the mech better...
Patrick, it's a game of caution from here. I interrupted him firmly, driven by Charlie's stare in the corner of my eye, urging me to save him from strangling himself. We don't want anything else bad to happen to anybody, okay? Patrick gulped, raising his eyebrows to indicate the point was finally received, and briskly seated himself again. Most of the room didn't detect the tension, and things went back to business as usual quickly, but I couldn't stop watching Patrick Body, nervously glancing around himself for the ninja sniper with a scope set on him for knocking too hard too late at night. He was shifty and sweaty. nervously tapping his foot on the floor. I wanted to assure him that he was all right, that he did good and nothing bad would come of it, but that's a complex concept to convey to someone with facial expressions and inconspicuous gestures. In another sense, I was jealous. His paranoid concern would disappear within weeks. He'd write his little article, distribute it to a few tens of readers, slap it on his resume, and it'd fade into nothing. Beam wouldn't even bother to censor it. In maybe a month, he'd be on with his life, not looking over his shoulder every second, not worried that maybe today was the day the guard noticed him fiddling with the lock on his cage and made an example of him. I had no ill will toward Patrick Body. In fact, if anything, I felt guilty that I'd almost pushed him too far. Yet in the malicious pits, the darkest corners of my brain, I sort of liked the idea of watching him squirm a little bit, because the fear was temporary for him. It was permanent for me.
I got one for Shade, actually.
And the crowd collectively hissed and booed, tossing crumpled up sheets of papers at the fat newbie idiot wasting their overtime with unanswered inquiries directed at a stubborn mute. Charlie herself didn't flinch, just kept rubbing her boots together, propped up on the table, crossed at the ankle, as she sucked a lock and made that clicking noise with the nails on her ring finger and thumb.
Any truth to the rumor that you're dating T.O. Smith?
Who is T.O. Smith?
Sidney asked, not particularly directing his question anywhere, just expressing his surprise that there was a name in the universe he didn't already have in his mental Rolodex.
Wasn't actually asking you, Purple. But he's a professional surfer out in Southern California, claims to be Charlie Shade's current top booty call. A few pictures from the paparazzi confirmed they were seen together.
They were not seen together.
Sidney interrupted this so-called reporter's bullshit evidence.
Charlie's schedule has been released to the public countless times to quell such rumors. There is no room in it for dating.
Well, if it were me that had Charlie's, shall we say, attentions, we wouldn't be doing much dating.
He smirked sleazily.
Besides, that seems unfeasible to me, considering she could pop over to Cali for a quickie with Surfer Boy in 5 seconds, be back before a coffee break ended.
None of us drink coffee.
Sidney growled.
It's a figure of speech, Purple, and again, I'm not asking you.
Maybe if you wanted her to answer a question? I cut in before Sidney could escalate the situation, even though I was just escalating it myself. You could try something a little more dignified than dating rumors.
Hey, man, this is what the people want to know.
Then people don't deserve to hear her answer, all right? How about the fact that today she ungrouped 3 tons of steel without so much as a dizzy spell, and 2 years ago that would have killed her? Can you ask her that? Sid and I get questions like that about our ability progression all the time. Not to mention battle tactics, political implications, infrastructural procedure. Meanwhile, she gets, are you dating this asshole who's trying to pump up his rep with lies? And nobody gets why she's silent. Why should she bother answering that? Would you answer that?
I ain't an international sex symbol, kid.
Indeed, and you are quite far from that.
Sidney scoffed, and the assembly let out an uneasy spurt of laughs. Charlie's the best fighter of the 3 of us. She's our leader in the field, the most experienced, Ava's founding member. She knows history. She sees things other people don't. You refuse to tap into that unique perspective, and then you get upset that she won't talk to you? Hell, even without all of that, just by virtue of being a person, she's entitled to more robust questions than T.O. Smith. I scoffed and started to throw up a wanking gesture, mimicking the one Charlie had done earlier, but I remembered I'd already pushed my image the wrong way once today. Who, by the way, if she was dating him, I would have met him, and so would Sid, and I don't have the slightest idea who he is.
Neither do I.
Sidney confidently asserted. At this point, Charlie reached out and brushed my shoulder, and once I turned my head to face her, she calmly tapped her index finger against her lips. I laughed because she was right. He wasn't worth the effort, and Charlie didn't need me or Sidney standing up for her still. I couldn't help but get a little bothered by guys like this, especially when she didn't say anything to stop it.
Fine.
The fat ass mumbled when it was clear nobody else would add anything.
Another one for Charlie?
Make it respectable.
And there's an internet rumor going around that you're starting an OnlyFans.
I sighed, contemplating for maybe 2 seconds if getting rid of him by tossing him out the window would break all of his bones or just kill him, then considering if I actually cared that much. But during those 2 seconds, Sidney stood up, and it was one of those overly emphatic stands he had a tendency for, where he tossed the chair he was sitting in into the wall behind him. And as the flashbulbs flashed and a furious murmur of typing, writing, and surprise exclamations overtook the crowd, I flew over the table, cutting Sidney off on his way around it, just as he hopped off the riser step, pressing both of my hands into his chest. Sid, easy, bud, easy.
This man is disgusting.
Sidney, extending a finger over my head, whispered back, or at least what he considered to be a whisper. His voice was so distinctive in its tenor, it cut through all the commotion of the assembly, clearly audible to all of the reporters. He is. I know it, Sid. I agree with you.
I want to kill him.
The fat reporter who asked the question let out a nervous squeal and flinch in his seat. I couldn't help but laugh a little bit. You really can't kill him for that.
I suppose you are right. I will just punch him.
Sid, buddy, you gotta go sit down, all right? Take Charlie's lead on this. It's not worth it.
Can we stop the theatrics?
The asshole asked, confidence restored now that it was clear I wouldn't let Sidney kill him. He was clearly fishing for a fiasco at this point, but he was using the right kind of bait.
I mean, look at the way she dresses under the trench coat. She's kind of asking
You better
for it.
shut your fucking mouth before I rip your tongue out. Do you understand me? I snapped over my shoulder, still pushing both hands into Sid, and again, the crowd buzzed more excitedly than ever. Good old boy Jaxon dropped an F-bomb, truly front-page worthy news in this world of systematic annihilation. I can only barely hold him back. Don't make me restrain myself as well.
Look, I'm just doing my job.
She wears what she wears for tactical purposes. It's faster to group fewer particles, and she only uses the trench coat because of perverted, misogynistic human garbage like you, who, I should remind you, she's saved at least a dozen times just by virtue of you living in the capital. So honestly, if the best question that you can construct for somebody you owe your pathetic existence to 10 times over is when can I see your tits, maybe I'm the biggest asshole in the room for holding back Kavorsky.
Oh, Jaxon. There is still time. Stand aside, brother, and I will swiftly deliver said retribution.
I spun my head back around to explain that it was intended to be an idle threat, but I was interrupted by a familiar laughter. It was a laugh that set my soul at complete ease, regardless of the situation, and a laugh that silenced the bustling room almost instantly.
Wow.
She finally took her feet off the table, leaned into her microphone, and said something during a press conference. A monumental first that blanketed the vigorous crowd in nonplussed reticence. Even Sidney and I held our breath.
I gotta give you props for the sack. Bold strategy. Stupid. Really, I never would have responded. But I think you knew that you could get my boys all riled up enough to pry something out of me, and I should point out, you actually owe Sidney your life, because believe me, you were seconds from flying out of a window courtesy of Teaque if he hadn't stood up.
I smirked. Sometimes it worried me, but usually it was just impressive and oddly flattering how accurately she could anticipate my telekinetic activity, like she could almost see it. Maybe by this point she sixed it. The guy, meanwhile, just gulped and stared at her. Between my tirade and Sidney's physical and domineering presence, he was too nervous to insist on an answer to a blatantly inflammatory question, but to my immense surprise, she did it on her own.
Your rumors are bullshit. I wouldn't even talk to someone childish enough to think surfing was a career, much less date him. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against sex workers and all of that, but see, my thing is, you, man. Just you. I have this image in my head, this image of you, sitting there in the bathroom with your bottle of fucking hand lotion and your box of tissues, fat, hairy, disgusting as fuck you, sweating and grunting as you pound one out to some picture of me, and this image is so utterly revolting. The only thing preventing me from killing you right now, to ensure it never happens in real life, is the knowledge that for the goddamn life of me, you will never get that fucking picture. Never. And if anyone ever asks why, tell them it's because you, yes, you, personally, sir, are such a loathsome, rancid fuck shit.
She hit the ending consonants of the last two words with a little extra pop to enforce the finality of her speech. You could have heard the world's smallest butterfly landing on a pillow in that room as she leaned forward and snarled at Peter.
How's that, Peter? Adequate response?
Level 4 clearance required for access to. Welcome, Agent Murphy.
Riveting show, guys.
Murphy chuckled as the doors to the elevators finally blocked the relentless bulb flashing and dull roar of meaningless paparazzi questions.
It is getting to the point where these press conferences germinate a higher anxiety in me than the busts themselves.
You said it, Big Purple. Those aren't people. They're leeches. I can't even understand how you two answer half of their questions.
Which, while we're on that subject, mark up the damn calendar.
Murphy wrapped his arm around Charlie and she snickered and brushed him off.
Front page news, Charlie Shade speaks. Fucking glorious answer, sweetie. And you know, that'll be all they write about too. The ones who can figure out a way to censor it appropriately and get it by their editors without losing all the punch anyway.
They should know better, I said, looking straight ahead and folding my arms. All they've ever wanted is a single quote from Charlie. Now they got one, and it's so laced with profanity and masturbation allusions, half of them are gonna have to summarize it. I don't know what he expected. She checked me with her hip, like I'd uncover her intention all along, like it was some impossible to guess mystery in the first place, and I glanced down at her with a wink and a wry smile.
Gotta ask, though,
Murphy said, utterly missing our affectionate display immediately to his left.
why this one? You've ignored more legitimate questions than that in the past, Charlie. Hell, I'm not sure I can make up a less legitimate question, so why'd you respond now?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to nip all of that kind of talk in the bud, you know?
She answered Murphy, but didn't look up from her boots.
Not happening. Don't give anybody any ideas that it's even a possibility to happen. Best not dwell on it. I just wanted him to know.
And Murphy nodded and dismissed it instantly. A good enough reason, and a sensitive enough subject to warrant not prying. I didn't have the foggiest clue what sorts of things a guy like Murphy tended to think about, but he didn't have any reason to distrust any of us, especially Charlie, with all their history. So I'm sure he just accepted her answer at its face, but maybe he contemplated a tiny bit the ambiguousness of that pronoun, him. Was him the fat, nasty reporter who asked the question to prevent him from asking it again, or was him our asshole press secretary, Peter, who, without such a definitive no, would pursue this kind of thing emphatically now that it had been brought up? Maybe him was Prophet, who was unpredictable enough to latch onto an idea that scandalous and distracting from the bigger picture. In the end, it was a pointless determination. It was one of those, anyway. Didn't really matter which one. I'm sure Murphy thought about it for only a second or two, if he thought about it at all, but I knew better. By the sideways eye contact, the subtle upturn of the corners of her mouth, and that faintest pink tint that splashed onto her cheeks, Murphy wouldn't have guessed it even if he'd noticed her. Neither would Sydney. It was that discreet of a signal, yet I knew it for certain. I was him. Answering that asshole's question was essentially sacrificing her reputation. The next 10, maybe 15 press conferences would be rife with questions directed at Charlie. Obnoxious, sexist, inane questions that she'd casually ignore as she propped her boots on the table, leaned just far enough back that her chair didn't tip, and made that little clicking noise between the fingernails of her ring finger and thumb. It would take weeks to reestablish what was before today a certain fact. Charlie Shade didn't answer questions, and she broke her own defenses, welcomed all of the inevitable future garbage, and spoke up for this one not because she thought it warranted an answer. Charlie didn't care about that sort of thing, jerks wanting to see her naked, but she wanted me, specifically me, to hear her shut it down. So she spoke up, put it to bed. Even though it wasn't important to her, even though I already knew and believed everything she said emphatically. She said it anyway, in front of the Associated Press and the devil himself, this vague, unnecessary, unspoken pact of exclusivity in our twisted, backward romance. Charlie Shade was mine, and mine alone.
Thank you for listening to The Beam Chronicles, a fiction podcast written and produced by me, MJ Dooney. Bit of a twist ending there. I kind of hate will they won't they stories. Jim and Pam are low-key a terrible couple. So I just skipped ahead to the part where they do. I feel like they kind of earned it already in the last book, but don't worry, it'll flesh out throughout this one. Trust the process. I forgot to mention last time that I really appreciate 5-star reviews on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I've said that before, so it's not like it's a huge deal that I forgot, but I'm going to make a special point to say it again today because that's really the best way to help the show. I guess beyond that, you can tell your friends about it if you think they'd enjoy it. I'm always so fascinated by the places where people are listening from, and I'm curious to hear from people. Email has always been my primary way of interacting with the select few people who want to make a comment or two. beamchronicles@gmail.com. Let me know if you can draw. I can give you money. I'm trying really hard this book not to care so much about the numbers and just kind of enjoy the ride. So that said, you can still follow me on social media. There just won't be that much there. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. Just search for the show, Beam Chronicles. Maybe one day I'll have a more cohesive package of things for you to look at. All music and sound effects were sourced through the Epidemic Sound Library. Special thanks to Sergio Duarte for creating the cover art for this podcast. There is new cover art in progress. I'll probably change this one to the Jaxon cover in a few weeks. There's going to be a Jaxon one and a Sydney one and a Charlie one, depending on who the perspective character is, which I think is sweet. But I just really wanted to stick to my schedule, so we'll just use the one that I already have. I think that's all. Thanks again for listening.